Dead Souls. Part 2. Nikolai Gogol spent over a decade working on the second volume of Dead Souls, his satirical masterpiece about corrupt Russian society. But he never finished it because he burned the entire manuscript in his fireplace in February 1852. The sequel was supposed to show redemption for the morally bankrupt characters from the first book, but Gogol became increasingly obsessed with religious perfection and fell under the influence of a fanatical priest named Father Matthew Konstantinovsky. As his mental state deteriorated, Gogol began to believe the manuscript was sinful and imperfect, unworthy of publication. On February 11th, 1852, in a state of religious mania and deep depression, he threw the pages into the fire and watched them burn. Only a few fragments and early drafts survived, approximately 5 chapters that give us a glimpse of what might have been. Some scholars believe he may have been delirious with fever when he destroyed the work, but the act was consistent with his growing psychological breakdown. 10 days after burning the manuscript, Gogol died, possibly from self-imposed starvation as part of his extreme religious practices. The loss is considered one of the greatest tragedies in Russian literature. The surviving fragments show a darker, more psychological direction than the first volume, with Gogol's mental deterioration visible in the prose itself. His study would have been lit by candles, religious icons hanging on the walls, as the pages curled orange in the flames and turned to ash. The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Charles Dickens died on June 9, 1870, leaving his final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, forever unfinished, literally stopping mid-sentence in the middle of a chapter. He had completed exactly 6 of the planned 12-monthly installments, meaning the murder mystery that opens with a young man's disappearance would never reveal its killer. The novel marked a dark departure from Dickens's typical style, opening in an opium den in London's East End and featuring themes of drug addiction, obsession, and sexual jealousy. The main suspect is John Jasper, a respectable choirmaster in the fictional cathedral town of Cloisterham, who secretly frequents opium dens and harbors an obsessive love for Rosa, the fiancée of his nephew Edwin Drood. When Edwin vanishes on Christmas Eve during a violent storm, Jasper's behavior becomes increasingly suspicious, but Dickens never wrote the chapters that would have revealed the truth. For over 150 years, scholars and readers have debated the intended ending, with some evidence suggesting that Jasper was indeed the murderer, but would have escaped justice. Dozens of authors have attempted to complete the novel, but none can match Dickens's psychological complexity. The Victorian setting adds to the darkness, with fog-shrouded streets, dark cathedral cloisters, and the heavy smoke of opium dens creating an atmosphere of dread. Dickens left no notes or outline revealing his plans, though his friend John Forster claimed to have discussed some plot points with him. The unfinished nature of the work has become part of its legend, a murder mystery that can never be solved because its creator took the solution to his grave. The Castle, Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka's The Castle is an existential nightmare about a man identified only as K, who arrives in a village and tries desperately to gain access to the mysterious castle looming over it. But Kafka died of tuberculosis on June 3, 1924, before finishing the novel and explicitly ordered his friend Max Brod to burn all his unpublished manuscripts. Brod refused and published The Castle in 1926 against Kafka's wishes, preserving one of literature's most suffocating works. The novel has no resolution because it literally breaks off mid-sentence, with K still trapped in the village's bureaucratic maze, endlessly seeking permission to enter the castle or even speak to its officials. Each chapter deepens the impossibility of K's task as he encounters more obstacles, contradictory information, and circular logic from village authorities. The narrative is repetitive and cyclical, mirroring K's futile efforts, and the atmosphere grows increasingly oppressive as he realizes he may never succeed. According to Brod, Kafka had told him the intended ending. K would eventually die of exhaustion, still waiting for permission, and only then would the castle grant him the right to live there, a final cruel irony delivered after death. The incompleteness actually enhances the horror, because Kay's quest has no end, just like the book itself. The setting is perpetually covered in snow under overcast skies, with the castle always visible on the distant hill, but never reachable. Kafka's decision to order the manuscript destroyed suggests he considered the work too dark or personal, a glimpse into psychological suffering so profound that even its creator wanted it erased. John Pataki's The Manuscript Found in Saragossa, final sections. Jan Pataki worked for decades on The Manuscript Found in Saragossa, a complex Gothic novel featuring nested stories within stories, but he died by suicide on December 2nd, 1815, before completing the final sections, and the novel exists in multiple competing versions that scholars cannot definitively reconcile. The Polish nobleman created an intricate frame narrative containing tales of demons, ghosts, incest, and torture, with each embedded story growing progressively darker and more psychologically disturbing. Pataki was suffering from severe mental illness and paranoia in his final years, and according to some accounts, he believed he was transforming into a werewolf, though historians debate the reliability of this claim. The manuscript exists primarily in two versions, one from 1804 and another from 1810, but neither is complete and they differ significantly in structure and content. On the day of his death, Pataki reportedly shot himself with a silver bullet he had fashioned from a sugar bowl blessed by a priest, though the exact details remain uncertain. The novel's increasingly disturbing content reflects his deteriorating mental state, with themes of madness and transformation becoming more prominent in later sections. Set in the Spanish mountains with isolated inns and supernatural apparitions, the work influenced later horror and fantasy literature despite its incomplete state. Multiple scholars have attempted to reconstruct a definitive version by combining the manuscripts, but the author's suicide and the fragmented nature of the surviving texts make this nearly impossible. The incompleteness adds to the novel's dark reputation, as does the tragic manner of Pataki's death, while obsessively perfecting his maze-like narrative. Bruno Schultz's Lost Manuscripts. Bruno Schultz was murdered on November 19, 1942, at age 50, shot on the street in Nazi-occupied Drohobych, Poland, by Gestapo officer Karl Gunther, and the manuscript of his novel The Messiah, which he had been working on for years, disappeared and has never been recovered despite extensive searches. The Polish Jewish writer was known for surrealist, psychologically dark fiction, featuring themes of decay, sexual obsession, and grotesque transformation, and he illustrated his own work with disturbing, dreamlike drawings. Before his death, Schultz had hidden the manuscript with friends, hoping it would survive the war, but it vanished in the chaos of the Holocaust. Some scholars believe the manuscript was destroyed during the fighting, while others think it might have been hidden in the walls of buildings that were later demolished during Soviet-era reconstruction. Occasional claims of discovery have surfaced over the decades, but all have proven to be hoaxes or misidentifications. The two-story collections Schultz published during his lifetime, The Street of Crocodiles and Sanatorium Under the Sign of the Hourglass, showcase his unique, dark vision and suggest that the Messiah would have been even more psychologically complex. The loss represents not just a single manuscript, but the broader cultural devastation of the Holocaust, which destroyed countless works of art and literature along with their creators. The content of the Messiah remains completely unknown, preserved only in brief mentions in Schultz's letters to friends. His death was arbitrary and sudden, part of a petty dispute between two Nazi officers, making the loss even more senseless and tragic in the context of the war's larger horrors. Answered Prayers, Truman Capote. Truman Capote claimed for years that he was writing his magnum opus, a Proustian masterpiece called Answered Prayers, that would expose the secrets of New York high society. But when he published 3 chapters in Esquire magazine in 1975 and 1976, the scandal destroyed his social life, and he died in 1984 without producing the rest of the manuscript he insisted existed. The chapters, titled Mojave, La Côte Basque, 1965, and Unspoiled Monsters, contained thinly veiled portraits of his rich socialite friends and revealed their affairs, drug use, cruelty, and darkest secrets. The people he had written about immediately recognized themselves and were outraged, cutting him out of their lives completely and publicly denouncing him. Capote claimed he had completed over 400 pages of the novel, but after his death on August 25, 1984, from complications of drug and alcohol abuse, no additional manuscripts were found despite thorough searches of his belongings. The mystery remains whether the other chapters ever actually existed, or if Capote invented them as leverage to maintain relevance in the social circles that had rejected him. Some biographers believe he never finished the book and used the claim to keep people interested, while others think he may have destroyed the pages himself or that they were stolen. The 3 published chapters show a darker, more vicious Capote than the charming writer who had been a fixture at glamorous parties throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. His physical and mental decline accelerated after the scandal, and the promised masterpiece became a symbol of literary failure and social destruction, with the darkness coming not from the content itself, but from the real-world devastation it caused. Sylvia Plath's second novel. Sylvia Plath was working on a second novel about her marriage to Ted Hughes when she died by suicide on February 11, 1963, and the nearly complete manuscript disappeared, with Hughes initially claiming it was lost before later admitting in the 1980s that he had destroyed it. The working title was possibly Double Exposure or Double Take, though this remains uncertain, and the novel was reportedly darker and more autobiographical than The Bell Jar, focusing on Hughes's infidelity and the breakdown of their marriage. Only fragments and mentions in Plath's letters survive to give us any sense of what the book contained. Hughes claimed he destroyed the manuscript to protect their children from the painful details about their parents' relationship, but he also destroyed portions of Plath's final journals, leading to massive controversy in the literary world. Critics accused him of censorship and controlling Plath's legacy, essentially silencing her voice and her version of events. The destroyed novel would have provided Plath's perspective on the marriage that ended so tragically, and many scholars consider its destruction an act of literary vandalism. Hughes's estate eventually issued an apology decades later, acknowledging the significance of the loss. The darkness of this unfinished work comes not just from its subject matter, which dealt with betrayal and psychological suffering, but from the act of destruction itself, which prevented Plath from telling her story in her own words. The image of the manuscript pages burning or being thrown away represents the silencing of a woman writer whose talent was cut short by suicide at age 30, leaving us to wonder what truths she would have revealed. The Pale King, David Foster Wallace, hanged himself on September 12, 2008, at age 46, leaving behind an unfinished novel about IRS tax examiners that explores crushing tedium, existential emptiness, and the darkest aspects of depression. The Pale King was found on his desk after his death, organized into approximately 1,100 pages of drafts and fragments that he had been working on for nearly a decade. The novel is set in a regional examination center in Illinois and follows various IRS workers as they process tax returns, with the narrative examining the psychological toll of enduring mind-numbing boredom and bureaucratic despair. Wallace's depression is visible in the increasingly dark tone of the manuscript, and the incompleteness mirrors the novel's own themes about the impossibility of completion and endurance. His editor, Michael Peach, assembled the fragments into a publishable form that came out in 2011, complete with notes explaining what was missing and how the pieces were arranged. Some chapters are complete and polished, while others break off mid-sentence or exist in multiple conflicting versions. The novel literally depicts characters staring at walls or documents for hours, trying to maintain focus and purpose in the face of soul-destroying monotony. Critics have debated whether the book should have been published at all, given that Wallace never finished it, and might have changed or abandoned major sections. The gray IRS office, with its fluorescent lights and endless stacks of paper forms, becomes a physical manifestation of depression itself. Wallace's suicide casts an unavoidable shadow over a work that examines whether human consciousness can bear sustained attention to tedium, making the incompleteness feel both tragic and somehow appropriate to the novel's concerns about the limits of endurance. The Last Dangerous Visions. Harlan Ellison first announced The Last Dangerous Visions in 1973 as the third volume in his groundbreaking science fiction anthology series, but he died on June 28, 2018, without ever publishing it, despite promising its release repeatedly for over 40 years. The anthology was supposed to contain edgy, controversial science fiction stories that pushed boundaries following the success of Dangerous Visions in 1967, and, again, Dangerous Visions in 1972. At various times, Ellison claimed to have accepted 150 or more stories from prominent science fiction writers, but the book became a running joke in the SF community, and then a tragedy as contributors died waiting for publication. Several authors eventually withdrew their submissions after decades of waiting, and some published their stories elsewhere after giving up hope. In 1987, writer Christopher Priest published a scathing critical essay titled The Last Deadloss Visions, documenting the project's dysfunction, and Ellison would threaten lawsuits whenever critics brought up the missing anthology. After his death, manuscripts were found in his house in various states of disarray, and debates continue about whether the book should be published posthumously. Notable contributors like Cordwainer Smith died without seeing their work appear in the anthology. The darkness here comes not from horror or violence, but from broken promises, wasted potential, and the slow transformation of an exciting literary project into a symbol of editorial ego and dysfunction. The tragedy is that many of these stories existed and could have been published at any point, but Ellison's perfectionism or paralysis or some unknowable psychological barrier prevented him from completing what he had started. Ralph Ellison's second novel. Ralph Ellison spent 40 years working on a follow-up to his masterpiece Invisible Man, but a house fire in Plainfield, Massachusetts in November 1967 destroyed approximately 300 pages or more of the manuscript, and though he continued working on it until his death on April 16, 1994, he never finished the novel. The fire devastated Ellison's confidence and creative momentum in a way he never fully recovered from, and he spent the next 27 years attempting to reconstruct and complete what had been lost. The novel, tentatively titled Juneteenth, was meant to be larger and darker than Invisible Man, exploring themes of racial identity through the story of a jazz musician who becomes a senator. The fire didn't just destroy pages, but seemed to destroy the spontaneous creative vision Ellison had captured in the original manuscript, leaving him paralyzed by perfectionism as he tried to recreate what memory and notes could not fully restore. After his death, scholars published two versions attempting to present his work: Juneteenth in 1999, heavily edited into a publishable novel, and 3 days before the shooting in 2010, a more complete scholarly edition. Neither version represents what Ellison originally intended or what existed before the fire, and debates continue about whether the published texts capture his vision at all. The tragedy here is not just the physical loss of pages to flames, but the psychological destruction of an artist's confidence, turning what should have been his second triumph into decades of struggle with a ghost manuscript he could never quite resurrect, ultimately leaving us with fragments of what might have been one of American literature's greatest novels. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.